Saturday, March the 27th, 1982, Vayikra.
Please turn in the Chumashim to page 427. David, I forgot to mention your name. What an act to follow, huh? I think you have a right to insist on receiving all duplicate presents, David, after this. Is she being nice to you? Is she being nice to you? We welcome our visitors, especially our synagogue visitors. We at the SAJ have, at this point of the service, a study session in which members of the congregation, visitors and guests should feel free to raise their hands, ask questions if they feel so moved. For those who are unsynagogued, I would just like to explain that in fact for over 2,000 years the central act of Jewish worship on Sabbaths and festivals has been the act of studying the Word. And this is what we do. We study the Word. And today I want to draw your attention to the second half of the Haftarah, which Heather read so beautifully, which contains one of the most picturesque criticisms of idolatry that our Hebrew literature possesses. Let's look at the description before commenting on it. We are talking about the prophet Isaiah, and the chapters from chapter 40 in Isaiah to approximately the 60th chapter are usually regarded by modern scholars as belonging to an anonymous author who we call the second Isaiah. You may well ask, isn't one Isaiah good enough? Why do we have to have a second Isaiah? Actually, many scholars believe there is a third and a fourth Isaiah. The reason is that in the ancient world, authors were very reluctant to claim credit for what they had written. The opposite takes place in the modern world, where authors take things that other people have written and give their own names to it. That's called plagiarism. In the ancient world, the situation was quite different. People had enormous respect for the past, enormous respect for religious tradition, and if a sage or a scholar thought of a new idea, he had enormous difficulty in accepting the fact that this came from him. His automatic assumption was that it had to be from the sacred tradition. It couldn't possibly be him. He was too unworthy. And so over a period of time, we have the kind of development in which the law of Moses contains material that could not possibly have been put in it by Moses, but which was added to it by later respectful authors who, as it were, undersold their own sense of worth and attributed it to the original Moses. All that was good belonged either to God or the tradition. Now, the reason why we talk about two Isaiahs is really very simple, because the first Isaiah prophesied in the 8th pre-Christian century. We know that because the names of the kings mentioned in the first book of Isaiah, the early chapters of Isaiah, are kings who lived in the 8th pre-Christian century. Whereas from chapter 40 and on, we have a clear description of the events that took place in the 6th pre-Christian century, when the Jews who had been taken captive to Babylonia were permitted to return by Cyrus the Persian. And in fact, the second Isaiah, whose name we don't know, was a very enthusiastic, volatile, creative, spiritual person who was very turned on by these events, the fact that the Jews were permitted to go back to Palestine and contemplate rebuilding their temple. Comfort ye my people, saith your God. Those are the opening words of the 40th chapter. They've been immortalized, of course, in the Messiah by Handel. And the words clearly refer to the exiles. We're talking about now not the 8th pre-Christian century, but almost 250 years later. Comfort ye my people, the prophet is saying in the words of God, speaking for God. Comfort ye my people, you were exiled to Babylonia, but now God has used Cyrus, king of Persia, as his messenger to allow you to return to the Holy Land. Comfort ye my people. Every valley shall be exalted. Every hill shall be made low, so it'll be easy to walk back, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed. It's very difficult for Orthodox Jews from New Jersey to reconcile the historical discrepancy between these 2 points, but we won't go into that right now. It's a problem which many medieval Jewish scholars sensed but didn't know quite how to tackle. After all, you have 250 years difference between the historical context in which these things were stated. So we are in the 6th pre-Christian century, and the prophet Isaiah is urging, the second Isaiah is urging the people to worship only the God who is the God who cannot be portrayed in images or idols, the God who is the God of all the world. And many scholars are of the opinion that it is only in these chapters of Isaiah that we get the picture of the pure monotheistic idea of the Hebrews expressed clearly for the first time. That is to say, before this statement by Isaiah, the belief in our ancestors was not in what is called as monotheism, belief in one God, but henotheism, a word which means that the Hebrews believed that they had a God, but they did not preclude the possibility of other peoples also having gods. Every nation, every ethnic group, every historical entity was believed to possess its own God. The people of Ammon had Chemosh. People of Moab had Milcom. The Israelites had Yahweh. Every group had its own God. One of the most ancient sentences in our Hebrew Bible, which is used regularly in the liturgy morning and evening, Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, literally means, who is like thee, O Yahweh, God of Israel, among the other gods. That is to say, this is a henotheistic statement. It does not say that there are no other gods. It simply says that the Jewish God is bigger and better. With the second Isaiah, for the first time, we have an unequivocal statement that there are no other gods. The other gods are no gods. They are not gods. There is only one God, and that is the God of Israel. He is the God of all the world. He created all the world and all the peoples in the world, and for his own good reasons chose the Jewish people as his own people. I am simply quoting, I'm not affirming. This is what the tradition states. We have a very different perspective here in terms of our Reconstructionist point of view, but this is first articulated most clearly in the writings of 2nd Isaiah. That is to say, from about the 6th pre-Christian century, there is no argument but that the Hebrews have this notion of a universal God who cannot be portrayed in any image, and that all those other peoples, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Egyptians, all those other peoples worship not other gods who are inferior to Yahweh, but worship nothings. And in his endeavor to draw attention to this stupidity and folly, 2nd Isaiah draws a picture of what happened in the 6th pre-Christian century in an idol factory. Most of us know about the idol factories of the ancient world from the story which every Jewish child is taught, but which has no foundation in the Bible. It's a pure rabbinic fantasy, that Abraham's father was an idol manufacturer, and that Abraham discovered the true God by realizing that the idols that his father made were things of nothing. Every Jewish child learns the story of how Abraham destroyed all the idols, and put the hammer into the hand of the biggest idol and tried to convince his father that the idols had destroyed the big idol had destroyed all the small idols. And when his father remonstrated, Abraham says, but if you don't think that one of these idols could do damage with a hammer, how can you worship them? This chapter from 2nd Isaiah breathes that midrashic image. So we are now in a workshop in which idols are made, and the description is of the smith, verse 12, making an axe, working in coals, fashioning it with hammers. It's like a smithy. We can see the fire is there, the metal is being made. The carpenter stretches out a line, verse 13, he marketh it out with the pencil, he fitteth it with planes, marketh it out with the compasses, maketh it after the figure of a man, according to the beauty of a man. He's making an idol in the image of a man. He heweth him down cedars, taketh the ilex and the oaks, strengtheneth himself one among the trees of the forest, he planteth a bay tree, and the rain doth nourish it. Then a man useth it for fuel, and he taketh thereof and warmeth himself. Yea, he kindleth it and baketh bread. Yea, he maketh a god and worshippeth it. He maketh it a graven image and falleth down thereto. He burneth the half thereof in the fire. With the half thereof he eateth flesh. He roasteth roast and is satisfied. Yea, he warmeth himself and saith, Aha, I am warm. I have seen the fire. And the residue thereof he maketh a god, even his graven image. He falleth down unto it and worshippeth, and prayeth unto it, and saith, Deliver me, for thou art my God. They know not, neither do they understand. Their eyes are bedaubed, that they cannot see, and their hearts, that they cannot understand. And none considereth in his heart, neither is there knowledge or understanding to say, I have burned the half of it in the fire. Yea, also I have baked bread upon the coals thereof, I have roasted flesh and eaten it. Shall I make the residue thereof an abomination? Shall I fall down to the stock of a tree? I've got a problem with this. We can see and we can hear very clearly what Isaiah is saying. He's saying, how can you take a piece of wood and chisel bits of it off till you have a totem pole or the face of an idol, and then you gather up the chippings because you're hungry and you're thirsty, you want to have lunch, and you take out your hamburger and you barbecue your hamburger on a fire made of the chippings that you've just chipped from the idol. Isaiah says, this is ridiculous. There's the idol, unfinished. You're having your lunch, a hamburger, on rye, mustard, and you're using the sawdust, you're using the clippings to make a fire. How can you be so stupid? I'm not so sure this is a good argument. As a matter of fact, I somehow wish Isaiah hadn't used the argument. Like many arguments which seem so convincing, they tend to boomerang. Let us apply this argument to the Jewish people. Let us apply the argument to the American people. Would anybody be convinced if somebody was in a factory which made flags, American flags, and there was some trimmings or whatever left, and whoever was working on the flag threw the trimmings in the fire or used the trimmings for some other personal effect, somebody came into the factory and said, look how stupid you are. With this cloth you make an American flag, and you had something left over, and you filled a cushion with it. What would be wrong with that argument? It's Heather.
What's wrong with it is that the clippings are supposed to be just as, not holy, but just as good as the real flag. And if you burn it, or if you use it for a cushion, then you're, in a sense, putting down the flag because you don't, because you're if you use, okay.
I don't agree with you, but I'm glad that you responded. I don't agree with you. I think what you're talking about is closer to what happened, I think, in the middle of the 60s when people who jogged in Central Park could be seen jogging in trousers made of the Union Jack, which I took personal offense against. I mean, really. And wasn't there some kind of a business in the 60s when people used the flag for other purposes which people felt were disreputable? Remind me, I have a short memory for the 60s. Flag burning, certainly, but people were using flags as clothes.
You make jackets, you make patches, you put on your dungarees.
Right. In other words, now, you see, Heather, there's a difference between the flag as a flag and the material which goes to make the flag. Could I have another response to the question? Isaiah, Stephen, could you stand?
I think there's nothing wrong with using trimmings of a piece of cloth because a flag is a flag, which is a piece of cloth. You cut a certain
But is that the reason why? Is that the reason why we ridicule people who make an idol or a flag out of something, the trimmings of which they use for their own personal needs? Because it's not a flag until you actually got the stars on. Supposing the flag had the stars on and there was trimming there, would it be improper to use the trimming? The thing that I'm trying to draw attention to is that Isaiah says, how can anybody be so idiotic as to worship an idol? Just come to the factory. There's the guy making an idol, and what is left of the wood he uses to cook his hamburger. What's wrong with that argument? I applied it to the making of the flag. You're going to a flag shop. Somebody uses the trimmings of the flag without proper respect. What is wrong? Please stand.
You have to distinguish between respecting the flag and worshiping an idol. I think in ancient times it was not there, but that the worship was actually attributed a supernatural power to the idol. And if you see how an idol is made from a piece of wood used to make hamburgers, maybe would have a smaller tendency to think that this is a holy object or a supernatural object. You don't think of the flag as being something that is holy or supernatural. It is something that represents an idea. But I think in ancient times the idol was the god rather than just representing the god. So how can you worship a god that was used to make hamburgers? I think that's the idea he's trying to get at.
Okay, Mark, and then Ricky.
Take this a step further. That midrash about the idol led us along a wrong path, I think. They weren't worshiping the idol per se. They were worshiping, that was a representation of what they were having. It was the power that represented. In the same sense, we don't worship the flag. We have reverence for the flag. The flag is close, everybody knows. It represents something.
Before calling on Ricky, have you ever been outside of New York on July the 4th? Like in New Jersey? I don't know why New Jersey is coming up for special treatment this morning. You ever see that picture that was taken at Iwo Jima with the men putting the flag up? Do you remember that picture? Have you ever heard, certainly in the British Army, people who almost gave their lives in order to bring back the regimental colors? Nothing substantive in a flag? People gave their lives to protect the flag from being captured by the enemy. It was regarded as a mark of honor. People exposed themselves to all kinds of trials and tribulations to get the flag back. And in part of the country where we spend our summers, you better be very careful about what you say about the flag. If you got up anywhere where I spend my summers and said the flag is nothing in itself, it only symbolized something else, you'd get your tires slashed. And during the 60s, when people wore flags on the backs of their cars, what were those flags saying? Our country, love it or leave it? Is it as simple as this, Mark? I think it's a little more complicated. Ricky?
I view this whole question differently than anybody else.
Can you all hear, by the way? If you can't hear, come in front. It's much easier to hear in front. No, not you. The others. You stay where you are.
As an artist, I can tell you that you take what's just paint and just canvas and just sometimes little pieces of junk. What you combine it into is something else entirely. It has very little to do with those materials. It becomes something else. Abstractly, painting is made out of nothing worthwhile. The worth of the raw materials in a fine old master is probably about $8 or $10. We know that's not the value of the work. In the same way, a flag ceases to be only cloth. It becomes that symbol, and it has a different power. The reason his argument about the idols does not work is because to a person who has fashioned the idol, it has enough power. It's not a question of materials any more than a question of what our clothing is made of. It's just more important. It is a shirt.
Thank you. Adam, did you have your hand up? I thought you were going to try to say something. Fagel?
I was thinking just now of the Torah.
Yeah.
Torah, people will risk their lives for the Torah too. People go into a burning building to try and rescue
Right,
it.
yeah, right. Yeah.
It has the reverence given to it, but it's not worship. So we have the same reverence for not the same reverence for the flag possibly as we might have for the Torah. But there's that.
I had not gone to the Torah. I had one more example first. Supposing somebody, in the course of making the Statue of Liberty, there was a little bit of bronze or whatever left over, and they used it to repair a hole in their roof.
I would think they probably would. In America, that's part of the work ethic, the difference between symbols and added economic financial value is what is stressed in America. In regards to the example of the artist, in law, that is the only compensation an artist can get if his work is stolen or destroyed is to the materials themselves. In this case, that's no, the trimmings from the flag in the shop, if you got an efficiency expert would go to the federal flag shop and he saw all the ways that the trimmings were not used properly, he would be scandalized, I think.
Yes. Yes, Jeff.
Don't you see a little bit of chauvinism in this? I mean, isn't Isaiah saying my religion is better than their religion? After all, they take the flux and jets of their materials and they use it for unholy purposes. Don't you see the same chauvinism in the American construction workers who, during the 60s, when they saw the kids down there against the war, where the construction workers used the American flag in a chauvinistic manner and told the kids to get out of America and drop hot rivets on their heads from the 50th floor to show that they were American, but that the kids down there were some kind of commie. I see a very strong sense of cultural superiority in the lines which you're quoting.
Yes, I wanted to use the Torah as an example. Let's look at the Torah, for example. The Torah is made of animal skin with ink blots. Where does the holiness of the Torah reside? Heather? The writing? The words, the meaning. That's something else again. Stephen? Yes, but I mean, why can't we use the same argument? If somebody came into a scribe's office while he was writing the Torah, we'd say, I don't understand. I mean, that's ink and it's parchment, but it's only from the back of an animal, and these are just ink blots that you're putting on there. I think the same argument could hold, yes.
I'm just beginning to think that maybe it's the mind of the beholder that has these spiritual connotations in it, and it's that individual's mind which can withdraw it, regardless of whether the flag stands there or not, or whether it's shaping to be. So it's the individual who draws the spirituality to the piece of cloth or the cinders or the idol.
We're dealing with a very central problem of the meaning of religion, one which Rabbi Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionism, addressed himself to under the heading of what is known as sancta, holy things. But we don't have to use jargon to describe this concept. It's the problem of symbols. Everybody knows that there's a difference between liberty and the little old lady in New York Harbor. Everybody knows there's a difference between American values and ideals and the flag, which is just a schmata which symbolizes those ideals. It has no intrinsic merit in itself, neither do the ink blots nor the parchment itself. Any sanctity which has been attributed to the Torah is not because we're saving animal skin. It's the meaning of the words which people try to save. One of the most painful sights from the Holocaust was something that the late Cecil Roth, professor of history, Jewish history, showed me, where the Germans in Poland had used the Sifrei Torah from synagogues for cutting out soles for shoes. They needed to line, what do they call those things that you buy from Dr. Scholl's, you put inside shoes? Insoles. They had cut Sifrei Torah into insoles, and they had been put inside shoes, and people had walked on them. You see, it's a curious thing here. On the one hand, we know that it's not the ink and it's not the parchment, and yet the meaning is so closely bound up with it, especially in Jewish tradition, that before the sofer, before the scribe writes, he has to go to the mikveh. He has to be ritually pure. and all kinds of prayers have to be recited. The whole thing is performed in a purity and a holiness and a spirit of reflection and concentration to such a high level that in Judaism we've tried to make the flag-making process something whereby the entire flag factory becomes a kind of a place of worship, as it were. But even there, we cannot lose sight of the distinction. And in the distinction lies a big problem. The problem is that at its best, Judaism is a spiritual form of atheism. Atheism spelt with a capital A. In Jewish concepts, as soon as we can fix a God in an image or a concept, we are already in the dangerous presence of an idol. You see, because the problem in terms of... You want to say something? Go ahead. I'm in the middle of a sentence. I'm in the middle of a flow. Can I just proceed? I mean, can we honestly say to ourselves... Well, let me just make a comment, because I saw some eyebrows raised when I used the word atheism in connection with Judaism. If I may refer to Peter Berger. The book of Genesis, which begins, Bereshit bara Elohim, in the beginning God, one God, although it's a majestic plural, was pure atheism in the context in which that statement was made. Because in the polytheistic pagan world, where every tree and every valley and every river possessed its own pantheon of gods, for some ancient writer to stand up and say there is only one God was tantamount to atheism. The book of Genesis is theological atheism. If it is really understood properly, we should lose our fear of these words and try to understand what they really mean. Atheism means there is no God. The center of Judaism is that there is no way in which human beings can experience God. As soon as we have formulated an idea of God or made a definitive statement about God, that already becomes idolatry if we react to it in a slavish, literal, fundamentalist, dogmatic way. That is to say, believing in God is something we endeavor to approach, but we never arrive. Once we believe we have arrived, we have converted a living God into an idol. And there are two examples from Jewish tradition which indicate the fears of our ancestors. One is the fact that we do not know how to say the name of God. We do not know how to say the name of God. According to Jewish tradition, we once did know how to say the name of God. But not everybody was permitted to say the name of God. Only one person was permitted to say the name of God on the Day of Atonement, and then only after an enormous ritual preparation, and then only in the holiest place of what already was the holiest building in Jewish experience, namely the holiest of holies. And the tradition says that after the destruction of the temple, we forgot how to recite this Shem HaMeforash, the ineffable name. I have my doubts as to whether we ever knew how to pronounce the ineffable name. If you study the literature on the ineffable name, there are so many syllables in the ineffable name that it's almost as if tradition is playing a joke on us. There was no name for God because there is no God that can be named. As soon as you name a God, he no longer is a God from the perspective of Judaism. It's hard to be a Jew. We can sympathize with the Israelites when they wanted Aaron to make a golden calf. Who needed this new religion? Who needed, in the context of paganism and polytheism, to be told, thou shalt make no image of me? There is no image that can contain me. No flag, no idol, no image of man, no image of animal. But something which modern Jews very often miss. No words either. That is a book which is often regarded as an idol. The ark is not a sacred place in any other sense that it is a bookshelf. And in the eyes of Judaism, all bookshelves are sacred insofar as the books they contain are Torah. And as we Reconstructionists understand Torah, Torah means not only sacred texts written by Jews, but sacred texts also written by others and secular texts written by others, insofar as they can enhance and advance the spiritual quality of our lives. The great danger in Jewish tradition, precisely because we always felt that we were above this. Idolatry was Phayenim. It was the Gentiles that worshipped idols. We Jews were above this. And under the guise of this spiritual chauvinism, Jews have and do still worship idols. That is to say, the words become ends in themselves. I quoted one example of how our ancestors tried to avoid the idolatry involved in worshipping even the Jewish God. The need for a constant need for a spiritually atheistic perspective on all given definitions of what God is and what God wants of us. And that is the remarkable concept which comes from Greek thinking, but which the Jews developed way and above the source of origin, the difference between the written law and the unwritten law. This was already a concept in Greek life by the 5th pre-Christian century, but the Jews took it over and created something incredible out of it. According to Jewish tradition, nothing was supposed to be written down ever which was sacred. It all had to be preserved by word of mouth. It could never be put down definitively. There was a terrible fear that once something is put down in black and white, it becomes an idol. And the central thrust of Judaism is, thou shalt not worship an idol. Thou shalt not worship that which is fixed. And my understanding of Jewish tradition, that it was only under great duress that in the 5th pre-Christian century, the 5 books of Moses were canonized. They were handed down by word of mouth for hundreds of years. And an argument still reigns among scholars as to how long even what we call non-biblical material was handed down by word of mouth or written. A serious school of thought believes that even the Mishnah and the Midrash and the Talmud, to a very late era, was handed down by word of mouth. Now let me ask you a simple question. I really didn't give you a chance to speak, so...
I'm very glad I could let you finish your flow.
I'm glad too.
Midrash,
Yes?
the Torah is the wording of the Torah is so sparse that one can reinterpret ad infinitum. That's what keeps religion alive. That's why when you mentioned study as the central focus of activity, well, yes, that's the act of breaking out of the idol each week by re-examining what we're doing and the merits of what we're doing.
While you're talking, actually, I'm just thinking of a Kaplan story, which may be a tall story or a short story. Kaplan Hertzberg told it when he was here, but I heard it from a different source, so it may be apocryphal, but it doesn't matter. It's a good story. Kaplan taught homiletics at the Jewish Theological Seminary for 60 years. Homiletics means the art of giving sermons. Some people think that there is a doubt as to whether this art can ever be taught. However, Kaplan taught this art for 60 years, and it is said that a pupil, one Thursday morning when the seminar met, gave a sermon which Kaplan praised to the heavens. Saturday morning, the student gave that sermon in the Jewish Theological Seminary synagogue, and Kaplan was very critical. And the student went to Kaplan at the end of the service and said, I don't understand. When I gave the sermon on Thursday, you loved it, and on Saturday morning it was no good. Simcha, do you remember the exact words? I always get this wrong. Kaplan says, I've been reading since then, or, what? That was Thursday. I've grown since then. You see, that story perfectly hits what I'm trying to say right now. It's very difficult. It's very difficult for us because here we live in a religion which, on the one sense, demands from us ritual observance. Look, we're approaching Pesach, and people will be running all around Sloan's to buy boot polish, kosher Pesach, you know, the annual obsessive-compulsive festival. Here you have a reading from the Torah, the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus. And you'll notice on page 424, my revered teacher, Dr. Hertz, in trying to account for why we read this Sidra this morning, on page 424 says, the Sidra presents detailed instructions of service in the tabernacle, leading to obedience to God. In other words, to put it in more specific words, the Sidra is full of the nitty-gritty of getting animals and slitting their throats and sprinkling their blood and offering up their kishkas to God. You couldn't have a more nitty-gritty, down-to-earth mode of observing religion. The Haftarah deplores Israel's neglect of all worship. It is addressed to the Jews deported to Babylon after the first destruction of Jerusalem. Israel has been careless of God, but God, for his own sake, forgives. I disagree with my revered teacher. I think he's missed the point. Or that may be the point, but the central contrast between the Torah and the Haftarah is not that Israel has ignored God, but that Israel has made an idol of God. It is the second half of the Haftarah, which is the contrast between what is in the second half of the prophet Isaiah is in a sense a criticism of idolatry, which is also a criticism of the way in which within Judaism we can, for example, with Passover, be totally preoccupied with ritual and utterly neglect the ethical challenge of freedom. But on the other hand, also be so preoccupied with freedom that we forget the ritual challenge. It's not either one or the other. It has to be both. The critique of Isaiah applies to us equally, yes.
Some weeks ago, we talked about the Mishkan and the literal interpretation of the sanctuary. I think we were speaking to a similar point here of a tension between that which is literal and that which is symbolic and almost abstract. And I think that what happens in Judaism is that when we flip back to the idol making, which is, or there are prohibitions against the literal idol making, which would lead one to concrete worship of an object. And yet you can't abstract it so far that the people as a whole have no conception of a God. And I wonder whether anthropomorphic language isn't a kind of halfway house.
Well, I would say it's more than a halfway house. I would say it's absolutely inevitable and invaluable, and we can't live without it. And that is the paradox of religious life, that we can't live without the anthropomorphic language. Here we have then a situation in which the criticism that Isaiah makes of this idiotic idol worshipper, who is so stupid that he doesn't see that he makes an idol with one piece of the wood and then cooks his hamburger with the other piece, I suggest that this criticism applies to Judaism also. That there's always been a terrible danger in Judaism of turning our so-called superiority, both ethically and ritually and spiritually, into some kind of an idol without realizing that as soon as we fix something definitively, it has to be kept, it becomes an idol. The question that I wanted to ask before, and I asked this to the congregation, why do you think our ancestors were so averse, so opposed to writing down the law? Why were they so hotly opposed? Why is the Talmud full of the most incredible injunctions against writing down anything? Of course, it was violated. The rabbis had ponies. They'd bring them into the synagogue, notes, midrash, because memory, after all, couldn't contain everything. Apart from the actual sacred texts, there was a total prohibition against writing anything down. Why? Why would you think that if, yes?
And I was thinking of the comparison between the fact that the American Constitution is a written document and the British Constitution, evidently the Israeli Constitution,
be careful,
are not written documents. And each evolved in different ways, but I think the reverence to the American Constitution has resulted in some very strange contortions of it in the various decisions of the Supreme Court and all the other millions of decisions by other courts. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but one develops one way, another develops another way.
The central problem perhaps could be expressed in a well-known story, which I'm sure some of you have heard. The rabbi is the Rabbi, I should say, is talking to the man about marital problems, and the Rebbitzin is listening behind the curtain. And the man gives his story of how terrible the marriage is, and the rabbi says, you're right. And then the husband goes out and the wife comes in, and the wife gives a whole different story about what's happening in the marriage, and the Rebbe says, you're right. At which point, when he leaves, the Rebbetzin comes out from behind the curtain and says, "Husband, forgive me, I was eavesdropping, but I'm very, very puzzled." He says, "What are you puzzled about?" He said, the man came in and gave one story, and you said to him, "You're right." And then the woman came in and gave a totally diametrically opposed story, and you said, "You're right, I don't understand." And the rabbi looked at her and said, "You know what? You're also right." Here we have in Judaism this opposition. Ritual, halakha, an obsession, a preoccupation with doing the right thing at the right time, with the right materials, the right instruments. Whatever Passover is, however strict or unstrict you are, no one can fail to be impressed that there is no way to have Passover without coming to some kind of terms with the halakha. You can do bedikat chametz or you don't do bedikat chametz. You buy everything including coffee and sugar or you don't. You scrub your house down or you don't. But everybody knows that beyond a certain point, it isn't a Seder service. There has to be something. Some kind of an effort has to be made. Some kind of distinction has to be made. There has to be ritual. Some people have real problems with ritual. They cannot tolerate the notion that certain things have to be done in certain ways. It doesn't fit with this other notion that we're talking about, which says, as soon as something becomes fixed, as soon as something becomes rigid, it is dead. It is an idol. But unfortunately, there is no way of saying, and the resolution of this is that we have to meet somewhere in between, that we have a synthesis. You don't go so crazy over the ritual, and you don't go so crazy about the spiritual, and you meet somewhere in the middle. That simply isn't true. You're right, and you're right, and then the observer says from an anthropological point of view, but this is ridiculous. How can you have both of these two things functioning in the same religion? To which the answer is, you're also right. The idea that maybe in religion there is paradox, the idea that maybe in religion on some level the non-rational should be sanctified is something that never occurred to the first generation of Reconstructionists. We were so convinced that everything could be done liberally, that everything could be done sweetly, that everybody could go home and be happy. The idea that there were still distinctions between what was right in Judaism and what was wrong. The idea that halakha might still obtain. The idea that there still might be some spirituality in those age-old customs. The idea that the new Haggadah may not necessarily be the last word. I must have received on my desk this week about a dozen new Haggadot. I'm going to go bankrupt because each time a new one comes out, I get one. The latest one is one in which it says, by this one, God has no sex. Frankly, I find that rather depressing. I think every well-organized Seder service should have a little bit of sex. After all said and done, it is the celebration of spring. Okay, so here's a Haggadah in which every time God is referred to as our Father, or He, or Him, the translation has been put round. You cannot imagine how many different translations of the Haggadah there are. There are new versions and yet more new versions. I am ashamed to tell you, my dear friends, that this year, as in recent years, after I went through this liberal process, the traditional Haggadah, as it left the hands of those who formulated it, will be recited in the original Hebrew in my home. Some of it I will understand, some of it the guests will understand, some of it will be incomprehensible to them, and some of it will be incomprehensible to me. I can think of no more desire to alter the traditional Haggadah, which is a literary and spiritual entity which emerged at a particular form in Jewish history in an authentic form, an authentic era, an authentic creation. I can think of nothing worse of tampering with that than I would think of cutting out a section of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony or one of Beethoven's posthumous quartets. I may agree with it or disagree with it. It's not my job to tamper with it. I inherited it from the past. I try to understand it. It's not possible for me to understand it all. I will pick out a few of the symbols and the traditions, and the observer may say, but this is ridiculous. There are things in here which you don't agree with. And I say, you're right. You're right. There are things in here which I find difficulty with. I will argue with them. I will disagree with them. I will say, after reading a prayer, I don't accept this prayer, but I will include it. I don't expect my religion to be rational any more than I expect my mother, any more than in other words, there are certain... Please say something quickly, yes.
How do you decide what to include and what not to include?
What do you mean what to include and what not to include? The whole Haggadah is a very slender book.
Yes, but you say some rituals and not others.
You mean, I'm talking about the text. I'm talking about the text right now. I'm drawing a distinction between the text right now and anything else. I'm talking about the book. In other words, on my desk this week arrived several announcements that we have a new Space Age Haggadah, a Mickey Mouse Haggadah. Yes.
I have trouble with what you're saying.
Good. Stand, Jack, and have trouble with me. But before you have trouble, I just want you to understand, I am not saying that one cannot observe a Passover without fulfilling all the 630 mitzvot which relate to the Passover, the halach and the ritual. Although I think that without some kind of nod in the direction of the ritual, the Seder is meaningless. What I am saying is that we have inherited a libretto for this season. We have inherited a text, a sacred text, a classical formulation. I find that with all its defects, in its very almost irrationality in certain respects, it has more power spiritually when I wrestle with this irrationality and end in a no-win situation than when I read mellifluous paraphrases and sentences from modern versions which are strictly kosher a la feminism and yet don't seem to have that same kind of message for what I'm looking for. Jake?
To quote a very vulgar phrase from advertising, baby, you've come a long way.
Is that an insult or a compliment, Jake?
It's a great compliment. That is to say, if you can arrive, you have already been through all that, which has to give meaning to words. You now come to a much higher level of sophistication. You're sitting on a mountain where you can take this for what it is and know that you have not compromised anything intellectually or emotionally in your life. Can the same standard be applied to someone who comes with far less experience and who has to lean on the literal meaning of what he's reading? That's my question.
Excellent question. Can we have a congregational response to that? I don't deny this is a very good question. Simcha, could you stand here, please?
There's always been a tradition of guidance for what you should leave out and what you should include. And there's a tradition for that, too. I mean, it's not as if all parts of the Haggadah are treated with equal weight, even traditionally.
Well, within limits, yes. I suppose the one that I can think of immediately, Simcha, is the fact that if you're in a hurry, you can abridge the grace after meals. And Rabbi Gamliel said that, well, yeah, if you have to. Right, if you are in a real hurry, then all you have to do is to mention Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. It's true. I'm talking about the fact that the actual traditional text presents enormous problems, because some of the ideas in that traditional text violate my ethical sensibilities. But I would rather wrestle with my ancestors whose ethical sensibilities I cannot tolerate than be soothed by a text which only addresses itself to one aspect of my personality. I am only rational on one level. There is an enormous amount of non-rationality and irrationality. I need to find this reflected in the tradition. Simcha? The other Simcha.
I just wanted to add that that's the point. You're not always speaking just for yourself. There are many Haggadot that 30 years ago left out Shvoch HaMacha Al HaGoyim. It wasn't nice to yell at the God.
Translate.
It wasn't nice to say to God, pour out your wrath on the
Gentiles, please.
Not known you. And that was objectionable 30, 40 years ago. And the problem is that people do approach these things as if they're speaking only for themselves, as if they're not part of, I love the name Haggadah because it's a gerund. It's telling. It's not
Narration.
It's
Not a finished thing.
It's a process.
Right.
And to think that you speak only for April 7th, 1982 is wrong.
Yes, that was my big problem with the Reconstructionist prayer book after the 7-Day War. The Shabbat after the 7-Day War, 6-Day War, I looked in it was Shavuot, either Shavuot or Saturday. I was looking forward, because I come from an Orthodox background, in case you haven't noticed, for the sentence, Kol Goyim Sevavuni, B'Shem Adonai Ki Amilam. All the nations surrounded me. In the name of God, I cut them off. Sabuni Gam Sevavuni, B'Shem Adonai Ki Amilam. They surrounded me like bees. they were quenched like a fire of thorns. In the name of God, they were cut off. Those words were not in the Haggadah, in the prayer book. We've reintroduced them since. You see, what happened was that at the time when the prayer book was edited, people didn't feel that the Gentiles were trying to destroy the Jewish people. You can never tell with the traditional sentence. You can let it lie fallow for 100 or 200 years. But if the liturgy is in any way reflective of the collective personality of the evolving people, then that sentence will one day have a meaning. And what right do we have to preclude the possibility of later generations deriving sustenance? Let's pass over those quickly or even omit them. I would rather skip than exclude and abbreviate. I would rather use the Haggadah, the libretto, the classical text, as an anthology from which to excerpt and perhaps add supplementary readings. But the text itself should be there as a tribute to the past. Myron?
I must tell you, I understand what you're saying, and I understand your feelings, I think, but I just totally disagree, at least for myself. Just in another world. And for 17 years I've been running a Seder at my house, and we use the Reconstructionist Haggadah, which has many, many failings in many ways, in the same sense as the traditional does. But I must tell you that for me and my family and people who come visit with us, the basic Reconstructionist Haggadah has a lot of meaning. And the words that were added reflect the sensibilities that I have, being towards the end of the 20th century in America. And that a great deal of what's in the traditional Haggadah does not reflect that at all. Secondly, when we need other things, and my Haggadah has grown over the years, so that my Haggadah now has places where I excerpt things, I have pieces of paper all over it, and little quotes here and there, and I have to tell everybody it's not all in the Haggadah, and don't get upset. And I think that that part of what we do is very much involved in the growth of the Haggadah and a rejuvenation in very, very many ways a creation of what's going on. The traditional Haggadah is not out of my house. There are many copies of it, as there are others, and I think they should all be used, and they add something to the Jewish people as a whole.
I think I'm appealing for the presence of the traditional Haggadah, and at least for it to be used to some extent, insofar as it can be used at particular points of the service, maybe the part immediately preceding the meal. Myron, it's very funny while you're talking. First of all, I would like to re-endorse Simcha Weintraub's point. It's very hard, when one is Jewish, not to want to make Judaism mean what it means for us today. Sometimes we have to suffer through certain things, because it's not only what's meaningful for me today, but also what was meaningful then and what might be meaningful in the future. Judaism is not a one-man religion, nor is it a one-denomination religion. It makes life difficult, especially when it comes to publication. But it is something we can't completely ignore. Judaism is not sympathy for the moment. Now, in response to Myron, I appreciate that comment, Myron. I think when my children were small, the Reconstructionist Haggadah made a lot of sense. I find that it's very much a children's Haggadah. It expresses things very much in a children's mode. However, and here we have a difference of attitude, maybe perhaps to Judaism, I believe that authentic Jewish experience is adult Jewish experience which children learn to appreciate, and not an experience which is totally focused on the children. Within the framework of the traditional Haggadah, the child has a central role. There are the 4 questions. There is the father talking to the child. There are the Chadgadia, the songs which according to tradition were meant to keep the children alive. What I have felt for some years about the Reconstructionist Haggadah, although I say it was very useful when the children were small, but I'm wondering whether it was useful for the children were small because we, or I should say, didn't want to work hard enough to share with the children the grandeur of the classical libretto. This is a point on which, of course, all of us can agree. And I certainly am not speaking ex cathedra. I am saying this is my point of view. And I know that in many homes, the Reconstructionist Haggadah is used exclusively. I think if it's used exclusively, even as if the Orthodox traditional text is used exclusively, I think we lose out. I'm not going to say we need some blend. I'm saying you're right, and you're right, and you're also right. In fact, what I'm putting before you, Myron, is an impossible demand. Rabbi Zuckerman.
The difficulty I have with your position is that you take the position that in the year 200, that is about 1700 years ago, the Haggadah reached its final form. Now that's true, but that Haggadah took several hundred years to develop. If the Exodus from Egypt took place around the year 1200 BC, it took about 1400 years for that Haggadah to develop. And the position you appear to be taking is that after 1400 years of development, the Haggadah should not undergo any further development. It is final and complete and unchangeable after these 1400 years. But all these years have intervened since the year 200. 1700 years have intervened. And don't these generations also have the right of previous generations to add to the Haggadah, to alter the Haggadah, to have it reflect the new and more recent experiences of the Jewish people, to have it reflect their own ideas, their own convictions, and their own experiences and their own views of the future. You seem to be saying that the first 1400 years are okay, and it's final and complete then, and nothing can be added thereafter. But what I'm suggesting is that this process has the right to continue into our own day, and even after our own day into the future.
Arthur, I appreciate your point. I don't agree with you. I think the difference between us relates to the way we understand and experience history. I am not in a position, as I see it, to change certain things about life. There are certain things that are given. In the history of the individual, certain early crucial experiences which happen before the age of 7 or 8, as I understand it, indelibly affect the kind of human being that will develop. One can modify, one can shift slightly, but the crucial early years are fundamental. The Jesuits used to say, give us a child till the age of 7, and we have him for life. Jewish tradition understands that insight also, and of course psychology does. We can't alter our past. There's no way, for example, of deciding, since the Middle East is getting too hot, that we'll find another country in the world which has more space. The reason why the founders of Zionism thoroughly rejected Herzl's proposal that we go to Uganda, even though Uganda made much more sense, well, it did then, of course, it wouldn't have done with Idi Amin around, was because they felt that Eretz Yisrael isn't just something that once happened to the Jewish people, it's something that's indelibly fixed. No one ever suggested that we burglarize and annotate our 5 books of Moses. There are plenty of things in that 5 books of Moses, such as killing witches and burning homosexuals and killing people who commit adultery, which are offensive to the modern sensibility. Nobody in their right mind would dream of bringing out, except Reader's Digest, nobody in their right mind would think of bringing out a Torah annotated and abridged, vergrößt und verbessert. This is our sacred text. You don't like it, you live with it. Like parents, there are certain unalterables. I am simply suggesting that some of our classical texts are there. Take them or leave them. We can add to them. I'm not saying we shouldn't add to them. I'm not saying we shouldn't have additional Haggadot on the table. I'm not saying we shouldn't have additional English readings. What I'm saying is the central focal point of our deliberations on Passover must be that classical formulation, because it happened so long ago. In the history of a people, there are certain events which happen at a formative point in the evolution and development of that people, which are never repeated. They are lodestars. We guide our lives by them. Like the American Revolution, the War of Independence, the Civil War. There's no way of saying at a later stage, well, we should change this or change that or alter this or alter that to take into account what's happened in between, because in the birth of a people, as in the birth of an individual, there are certain events which irrevocably and irretrievably shape the destiny of that people. We may disagree and fight with those traditions that have come down to us from the past, but I think they have a right. One of the drawbacks of the Rabbi Kaplan's slogan, the past has a vote but not a veto, that in far too many modern circles, including Reform and Reconstructionist circles, the past doesn't have a vote at all. We don't know the past. How can the past have a vote if we don't know about the past? It's very easy to veto in the present. I don't like that. On the 27th of March 1982, I don't like that, so I'm going to vote against it. What about the vote from the past? What about an understanding that those experiences of the Seder service, ingrained, enmeshed in that text, is Alexander the Great, not just the Exodus from Egypt, the Persian era, the Macedonian era, the Roman era, without the experience and if all that we did on the night of Seder was to go over those few hundred years of history to get a sense of depth, historical meaning. The comment, for example, just one brief comment, we're running over time now. I see many hands up in response, but I'm going to have to wind up right now. I'm sorry. Maybe we can hold it till next week. One brief comment. Louis Finkelstein, who used to be the Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, wrote many learned papers on the original Haggadah. Some of those sections of the Haggadah go back to the 3rd pre-Christian century, when after the death of Alexander the Great, the Jewish community was split, some of them being in Egypt under the Ptolemies, and some of them being in Syria and Palestine under the Seleucids. I tell you something, of all the modern English prayers that I read, and I include the Reconstructionist Haggadah, nothing is more exciting to me each year when at the Seder table we come to those sentences which clearly were written under Ptolemaic rule and which therefore tries to make it appear that Pharaoh wasn't such a bad chap. After all said and done, you're living in an Egyptian country and you're trying to recite the story of the departure from Egypt. What are you going to say about Pharaoh? So you say Pharaoh wasn't so bad. Pharaoh, listen to this one, Pharaoh only decreed that the male children should be killed. But Laban, you see, Laban was, of course, one of the ancestors of the Jewish people, but Laban was a Syrian, Arami Oved Avi. And so by giving a dig at Laban, you're giving a shtoch to the Seleucids. This is incredible. There's a whole political imagery here. It's so relevant, it's so modern, the way we trim our theological sails to meet prevailing needs, political needs. You could just stop there, Arami Oved Avi. or Paro lo gazar ela al hascharim velavan bikesh la'akor et hakol. On that sentence alone, you could narrate the Haggadah all night until your children who have been watching the late show will come in and say, Father, it is time to recite the morning Shema. I doubt if they'll say that, but anyway. We rise for Aleinu on page 194.